Excellent. Hopefully you found that video informative. It dealt with section 2 in this chapter, which covers the elements of a contract. So let's go ahead and move into section 3, which is types of contracts. The book discusses the different types of formation of a contract. It starts off with discussing bilateral versus unilateral contracts. So let's go there. Bilateral contracts deal with a promise in exchange for another promise. Essentially, I promise to do a certain act, and in return, you promise to do a certain act, and we have what's called a bilateral contract. Let's say I want to sell my iPad for $200. You come up to me and you say, all right, I want to buy your iPad, but I don't have the money. I'll have it on Friday. So I tell you, okay, on Friday, I will sell you my iPad for $200. And then you in return say, excellent. On Friday, I will buy that iPad from you for $200. That is a simple bilateral contract. A unilateral contract is a promise for an act. The perfect example is those signs that sometimes you'll see about posting a reward. For example, a lost puppy. Help me find my puppy and I will give you $20. For example, people post those up on the lot all over the place, sometimes on telephone poles, for example. So what happens is you find the lost puppy, you go to that person's house. The idea is they now owe you $20 because you return the puppy. Essentially, that is a unilateral contract. They made a promise and you fulfilled that end of your agreement by giving the puppy that you found. The book gives an awesome example about arranging travel for a car. I encourage you to read it. But just keep in mind that basic unilateral contract is dealing with an offer and then somebody accepts it by completing an act to actually go through with it. Now, the book also talks about the revocation of a unilateral contract. A unilateral contract, you're essentially just throwing out a promise. Now, what happens if midway through, for example, you post up a sign saying, help with my lost puppy, I will give anybody $20 if they find it. Now, what happens if midway through you decide, you know what, I don't really like dogs anyway, I don't want to go through with it. And then somebody shows up at your house with the lost puppy. Well, they have no idea that you changed your mind. They went ahead through the trouble of finding the dog and then bringing the dog to your house. Is it fair at that point for you to refuse, even though that they've done it? Courts nowadays find no. Courts will find that you probably owe that individual $20 even though you changed your mind. Unilateral contracts are now deemed usually what they call irrevocable. That means once that promise is out there, you usually have to keep it. The book goes on to discuss formal and informal contracts. I won't spend too much time on that, but make sure to read through it because I want to get into express and implied contracts. An express contract is nice and easy. It's a contract that is clear, whether it's written or oral, that means spoken. For example, a lease agreement to an apartment. It's usually about 15 pages. Everything's clearly lined out about what you have to do, how much rent is, when rent is due, etc., etc. That's what you have as an express contract. Everything's nice and clearly and written out. So what is an implied contract? An implied contract is one which almost what it sounds like is that you made a statement that can be assumed to be implied, in fact, a contract. Now, what happens if somebody wants to perform that contract or somehow somebody's complaining because the contract wasn't fulfilled? Well, then the courts step in and the courts have to determine whether this was in fact indeed a contract. What does that all mean? Well, the book lists out the requirements for an implied contract on page 195 at the bottom right. The book notes the plaintiff, that means somebody who's suing to enforce the contract of an implied contract, must show that some service or property was given over. Number 2, continuing on page 196, the plaintiff expected to be paid for that service or property, and the defendant, the person who is being sued, must have knew or should have known that payment was expected. And 3, that the defendant had a chance to reject the services or property. So read through that example, find out a little bit more of what an implied contract is, because it'll sort of help you understand how sometimes, even though you may not have an express, fully blown contract written out with everything in clear detail, and a contract still may exist if these elements are seen and established in a court of law. This happens a lot of times when you have sometimes an oral contract. Two people agree to enter into something, but then some guy decides to change his mind. How do you go about proving that there's a contract? Well, one of those ways is you may have implied in fact contract. So read more about it, and we'll have discussions in class as well. My next post is actually going over what's a confusing sort of topic, is voidable, and unenforceable contracts. So read through the example that I'm going to post next, and so you can get an understanding. The book details it, but the website I'm going to be posting is helpful as well. So make sure to read through that before you go to our last video.